The wine glass in Lena Voss's hand trembled against the candlelight, and she told herself it was just the crowd pressing too close, the heat of 100 bodies in silk and velvet, nothing more than nerves making her feel like something in the room had already marked her as prey. She shouldn't have come tonight. Her cousin Callum had all but pulled her through the gates of Cade Hall after 2 years of Lena refusing every invitation, every attempt to drag her back into pack life after the humiliation of being cast out as a pup for having no rank at all. But the Blood Moon mating ball wasn't just any gathering. It was the one night a year when every pack in the territory sent its unmated wolves to stand beneath the same chandeliers, hoping to catch the eye of someone powerful enough to change their fate. Alphas prowled the edges of the ballroom in tailored black, their eyes flicking over the crowd the way a wolf studies a herd before it chooses. Beaters clustered near the wine tables, laughing too loudly, drinking dark red vintages that never seemed to run dry. And beneath it all, Lena could feel the current every unranked wolf learned to fear, the quiet understanding that tonight, she was inventory, not a guest. She'd heard the whispers her whole life. Everyone born without rank had. Whispers about the Cade bloodline, about an alpha king whose wolf was said to be older and colder than any in living memory, about a throne built on a challenge no one else had survived. The council called it history. Lena's grandmother had called it something else, a warning, passed down along with the strange gift that ran in their blood. The sight, her grandmother named it, that prickling awareness that told you exactly which wolf in a crowded room was dangerous before your eyes ever found him. And right now, every instinct Lena possessed was telling her to leave before someone noticed her standing so still. Hello friends. Before we journey deeper into Lena's story, I invite you to subscribe and share in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence here matters. Now, let's continue. You look like you're about to bolt, Callum said, appearing at her elbow with 2 flutes of champagne, his red hair catching the light from the massive chandeliers overhead. He pressed one glass into her free hand and grinned, easy and oblivious in the way only someone born into rank could be. Relax, Lena. Aunt Miriam didn't get you into this dress for you to hide behind a pillar all night. I'm not hiding, Lena said, though the pillar at her back said otherwise. I'm observing. You're hiding. Callum's grin didn't fade, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker of the same worry he'd worn since they were children, since the day the elders had marked her file with the word unranked and never looked at her the same way again. Nobody's going to bite you. Probably. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be. He nudged her shoulder. Just, try to enjoy one night, okay? For me. Lena managed a small smile and let her gaze drift back across the ballroom, past the marble columns wrapped in ivy, past the wall of portraits watching over the gathered packs like silent judges. She told herself the tightness in her chest was nothing. She told herself the sensation crawling up the back of her neck, that specific, ancient awareness her grandmother had warned her about, was only the champagne, or the crowd, or 3 years of avoiding rooms exactly like this one. She was wrong. The air shifted before she understood why. A path opened through the crowd the way water parts around something moving with purpose, and Lena felt him before she saw him, a presence pressing against her senses like a hand closing slowly around her throat. She turned, some instinct pulling her gaze toward the source, and found a tall alpha cutting straight toward her, his eyes locked on her with the unmistakable focus of a predator who had just found something he intended to keep. Well, the stranger said, close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating off him, and here I thought tonight would be boring. Lena took a step back. Her spine met the pillar she'd been using as cover all night, and there was nowhere left to go. I don't, she started. His hand closed around her wrist before she could finish, fingers like iron, his grip tightening as he lifted her hand toward his face and inhaled slowly, deliberately, like he was tasting something rare. Unranked, he murmured, almost delighted. Unclaimed. And no one's put a mark on you yet. His grin sharpened into something hungrier. That's about to change. Panic surged through her, sharp and cold, her wolf recoiling somewhere deep inside her chest, frozen the way prey freezes when the trap finally closes. She yanked against his grip, but it didn't budge, didn't even acknowledge the resistance. Around them, conversations faltered. Heads turned. And somewhere beneath the sudden hush spreading through the ballroom, Lena thought she heard the low, grinding sound of something enormous drawing a breath. Then it came, a growl that didn't just fill the room but shook it, low and resonant, rattling the crystal in the chandeliers overhead and stealing the air from every lung within earshot. Every alpha in the hall dropped to one knee before their minds had even registered why. Glasses trembled on their trays. The portraits on the walls seemed to hold their breath. The alpha holding her wrist went rigid, his fingers loosening just slightly as his head turned. Toward the far end of the ballroom, where the crowd was already parting, kneeling, for something Lena couldn't yet see. "Release her," a voice said, quiet, and somehow louder than the growl that had come before it. "Now." That was the moment Lena Voss understood, with the same certainty her grandmother's gift had never once failed to give her, that whatever had just entered the room was far more dangerous than the alpha gripping her wrist, and it was looking directly at her. The crowd parted like water fleeing a stone dropped into still air, and through the gap walked a man Lena had only ever heard described in whispers meant to frighten pups into obedience at bedtime. White hair fell loose around a face carved from something colder than the marble beneath her feet, and his eyes, when they found the alpha still gripping her wrist, burned the deep, arterial red of a wolf who had long since stopped pretending to be anything close to human. The Alpha King. Lena had grown up hearing his name spoken the way people spoke of storms, something you didn't summon, didn't invite, didn't ever want turned in your direction. Roman Cade. The wolf who had ended a dynasty in a single night and rebuilt it in his own image before the sun rose. She had never once imagined she would stand close enough to feel the heat radiating off him, let alone become the reason he crossed a crowded ballroom with murder written plainly across his face. He didn't hurry. That was the strangest part. Every instinct in Lena's body screamed that a man capable of silencing an entire hall with a single sound should be running, should be moving with the frantic urgency the moment demanded. But Roman Cade walked as though the distance itself had no choice but to shorten for him. Every wolf he passed dropped lower, foreheads nearly grazing the marble, spines bent in postures Lena recognized from old pack histories, the kind reserved for kings whose displeasure ended bloodlines. This wasn't respect. This was fear dressed up in the language of courtesy, and every soul in that ballroom understood the difference even if none of them dared name it aloud. "I said," Roman repeated, his voice carrying without ever rising above conversational volume, "release her." The alpha holding Lena's wrist, she still didn't know his name, only the hunger that had lived in his grip a moment before, finally seemed to remember what fear felt like. His fingers loosened, but a half-second too late, and that hesitation apparently answered some question Roman had been silently asking. He moved. Lena had time to register a blow of black fabric, the sharp crack of impact against unforgiving marble, and then the alpha was no longer touching her wrist at all. He was 6 feet away on the floor, one hand cradling a jaw that hung at an angle jaws weren't meant to hang, and Roman Cade stood between them with his back to her, shoulders coiled with a tension that looked like it was costing him something to hold in place. "You put your hands on an unclaimed wolf in my hall," Roman said, and the warmth in the room seemed to bleed out with every syllable, "in front of me." "My king, I didn't know." "You didn't ask." Roman crouched, gripping the fallen alpha by his collar and lifting him half off the ground with an ease that made something in Lena's stomach twist. "That is the offense. Not who she belongs to. That you decided her consent was optional the moment you decided rank made it your right." He let the silence stretch before speaking again, quieter now, almost gentle in a way that felt far more dangerous than shouting would have. "You have 1 hour to leave my territory. If I see you again, I will not be nearly so patient a second time." The alpha scrambled backward the instant Roman released him, vanishing into the crowd with the particular urgency of a man who understood precisely how close he had come to something permanent. The silence left behind rang louder than the music had all evening, a held breath spreading outward from the center of the room until it swallowed every corner of the hall. Roman turned. Lena had braced herself for many things in the seconds it took him to face her. Indifference, cold assessment, the detached curiosity of a king inspecting property he hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. She had embraced for the way his gaze moved over her like he was cataloguing every place she might be hurt, or for the way something in his expression cracked, just slightly, the moment he found her still trembling against the pillar. "Are you hurt?" His voice had lost its edge entirely, and the sudden gentleness of it startled her almost as much as the violence that preceded it. "No," she managed, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. I don't understand what just happened." "Neither do I," Roman admitted, and the honesty in it unsettled her more than anything else that night had offered so far. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, the careful approach of someone gentling something easily spooked. "Your name?" "Lena." She swallowed hard. "Lena Voss." Something flickered across his face at that. Recognition, maybe, or the particular stillness of a man quietly filing information away to examine later, in private, when fewer eyes were watching him do it. "Voss," he repeated, testing the shape of it. "Unranked line." "Yes." She said it the way she'd said it her entire life, like a confession, like an apology she'd stopped bothering to explain. "That doesn't matter to me." He said it plainly, like a fact rather than a kindness offered to soften a hard moment, and Lena didn't know which unsettled her more, that he'd said it at all, in front of a hall full of witnesses, or that some traitorous, exhausted part of her almost believed him. Around them, the ballroom had slowly begun breathing again, murmured conversations resuming in careful, hushed tones, though every eye in the room stayed fixed on the two of them with the particular hunger of people who understood they had just witnessed the opening scene of something none of them yet had the language to name. "Walk with me," Roman said. It wasn't quite a command, not the tone he'd used to send a man fleeing into the night, but it wasn't a simple request either, something suspended in the space between the two. Lena found herself moving before she'd consciously agreed to obey, catching her cousin Callum's gaze across the room, his expression caught somewhere between terror and disbelief, one hand half raised as though he couldn't decide whether to follow or stay rooted where he stood. She would owe him an explanation later. She didn't yet have the words to give him one, and she suspected she wouldn't for some time. Roman led her down a side corridor lined with portraits older than the pack itself, generations of Cade Alphas watching from gilded frames with the same unreadable expression their descendant now wore. The noise of the ballroom fell away behind them, swallowed by distance and thick oak doors, until they reached a quiet study where a fire burned low in the hearth and the rest of the world seemed to matter considerably less with every step deeper into the room. Roman gestured toward a chair near the fire. Lena didn't sit. "You're going to tell me this was nothing," she said instead, arms crossed tight against a chill that had little to do with the temperature of the room. "That you were just protecting a guest. That's all this was." "I could tell you that." Roman's eyes had faded from that terrible red back to an ordinary, deep brown, though something about the way he studied her still felt anything but ordinary. "It would be a lie, and I find I don't particularly want to start whatever this is by lying to you." "Then tell me the truth." He was quiet long enough that she began to think he might refuse after all, might retreat back into the cold authority he'd worn so easily in the ballroom. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of that command, only something rawer, more uncertain than she imagined a king allowed himself to sound in front of anyone. "My wolf reacted to your fear before I understood why it mattered. That doesn't happen. Not like that. Not for a stranger I'd never laid eyes on before tonight." He dragged a hand through his hair, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like a man badly out of his depth. "There's a word for it. Mate. I imagine you've heard it somewhere, even growing up unranked." Lena had heard it. Every unranked wolf grew up hearing about mate bonds the way other pups heard fairy tales told at bedtime. Beautiful, distant, reserved entirely for wolves whose blood was thought to matter. "That's not possible," she said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, sharpened by years of being told exactly what she wasn't allowed to hope for. "I'm nobody. I have no rank. Kings don't end up fated to girls like me." "Kings don't choose this," Roman cut in, gentler than the words should have allowed given how flatly he said them. "It chooses us. I didn't consult my wolf's opinion before it put a man on the floor for daring to touch your wrist without asking." Lena's laugh came out sharp, disbelieving, edged with something close to panic. "So what? I'm supposed to just accept that the most powerful alpha in this territory is somehow fated to a girl his own court wouldn't have let through the front gate a year ago?" You're supposed to accept nothing tonight, Roman said, steady. I only ask that you consider it. That's all I'll require of you right now. She studied him then, truly studied him, the ruin of his careful composure still visible beneath the crown he wore like armor he'd forgotten how to remove, and something in her chest loosened despite every instinct warning her not to trust the feeling. You didn't take that throne by asking anyone politely for anything, she said. That's the story, isn't it? That you challenged the last king yourself and didn't stop until it was finished. Something shifted behind Roman's eyes, old and clearly unhealed even after all this time. I did what needed doing, he said quietly. The last king let wolves like you starve outside pack walls because rank meant more to him than the blood in their veins. I ended that reign the only way his court ever understood, through strength, because mercy had already failed generations before me. He met her gaze, steady now, unflinching. I won't pretend that makes me safe, Lena. It doesn't, and I won't insult you by claiming otherwise. But it means I understand exactly what it costs to be discarded for having no rank to your name. I won't let that happen to you. Not while I still draw breath. Lena didn't answer right away. She didn't know how to answer something that reached that deep, that precisely, into a wound she'd spent years learning to hide from everyone, including herself. Somewhere beyond the study door, she could already feel it building. The weight of an entire court that hadn't asked for an unranked Omega standing this close to their king, watching, waiting with the patient cruelty of people who understood exactly how fragile something new could be, and precisely how easily it might be made to break. The days that followed the ball unfolded in a way Lena still couldn't quite make herself believe. She wasn't sent home. Instead, a room was prepared for her in the east wing of Cade Hall, for her protection, the staff explained, careful and polite in a way that felt more like caution than courtesy, as though she was something breakable they'd been ordered not to damage. Roman visited each evening. Never overstaying, never pressing, but never quite absent either. He would ask about her day, about the book she was reading, about whether the pack physician had cleared the faint bruising the rogue alpha had left on her wrist. Small questions. Careful ones. The kind that made Lena's guard lower half an inch further each time, despite every part of her insisting she keep it raised. It was the formal dinner on the fourth night that reminded her exactly how precarious her place in this world truly was. The dining hall stretched longer than any room Lena had ever stood in, its table lined with pack elders and ranked alphas dressed in colors that marked bloodlines older than the kingdom itself. Roman sat at the head, and Lena, against every instinct telling her to disappear into the wallpaper, had been seated at his right hand, a placement she understood immediately was not accidental. Miss Voss. The voice belonged to a silver-haired alpha near the far end of the table, a man introduced earlier as Councilman Ashworth, whose surname Lena recognized with a small, sinking jolt. The rogue alpha from the ball, Draven, had shared that name. She wondered, briefly, if that was coincidence, and something in the councilman's expression told her it likely wasn't. Voss, he repeated, testing the syllables like they left a bad taste. An unranked line, if I recall the registry correctly. That's correct, Lena said, keeping her voice level despite the sudden weight of every gaze at the table turning toward her. How curious. Ashworth's smile didn't reach his eyes. The Cade line has ruled through strength for 4 generations. I confess I struggle to see how an unranked bloodline serves that legacy. Careful, councilman. Roman's voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmur of the table like a blade through silk. You're welcome to question my judgment in private. Questioning my mate's worth at my own table is a different conversation entirely. The word mate landed across the room like a struck bell. Lena felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders, heavier than anything she'd carried in years, heavier even than the shame she'd learned to wear since childhood. Ashworth's jaw tightened, but he inclined his head with practiced grace. Of course, my king. I meant no disrespect. The dinner continued, but Lena felt the current beneath the surface long after the plates had been cleared, a current of quiet resentment that no amount of polite conversation could fully mask. She caught more than one alpha studying her the way Ashworth had, calculating, dismissive, already deciding she didn't belong. Later that night, Walking the garden path with Roman while the moon hung heavy over the hall, she finally said what had been building in her chest all evening. They hate me. They fear what you represent, Roman corrected gently. An unranked mate undermines the idea that rank determines worth. My court has built its entire structure on that idea for generations. You threaten it simply by existing beside me. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be comforting. He glanced at her, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was meant to be honest. You deserve that much, at least. Callum found her the following morning in the hall's library, his expression tight with the same worry he'd worn the night of the ball. You look tired, he said, dropping into the seat across from her. I'm fine. You're not. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Lena, I've heard things. Whispers among the staff. The council isn't happy about this, about you. Some of them are saying it out loud now, not just in private. I know. She closed the book in her lap, unable to focus on it anyway. Roman's told me as much himself. And that doesn't worry you. It did. More than she wanted to admit, even to her cousin, the one person in this world who'd never once treated her rank, or lack of it, as a measure of her worth. What am I supposed to do, Callum? Leave? Pretend none of this happened? I don't know, he admitted quietly. I just don't want to watch you get hurt because some king decided you were his fate, and nobody bothered to ask if the rest of his world would ever accept it. Lena didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one existed yet. That evening, as she crossed the east wing corridor toward her room, a figure stepped from the shadows near the stairwell. One of Ashworth's men. She recognized the house colors on his collar. He said nothing threatening, not directly. Only a slow, deliberate look, followed by 4 quiet words that settled into her chest like ice. Enjoy it while it lasts. He was gone before she could respond, disappearing down the corridor with unhurried steps, leaving Lena alone with the growing certainty that whatever peace she'd found in Cade Hall was far more fragile than anyone had told her. The message arrived 3 days later, slipped beneath her door sometime before dawn, a folded note in handwriting she almost mistook for Callum's, asking her to meet him at the border woods before the household woke, something about wanting to talk away from listening ears. Lena should have questioned it. Later, she would replay that morning countless times, searching for the moment she should have known better. But worry for her cousin outweighed caution, and she slipped out of Cade Hall alone just as the sky began to lighten at the edges. The woods bordering the estate were quiet in a way that felt wrong the moment she stepped beneath the tree line. Too quiet, the kind of silence that meant every living thing nearby had already sensed danger and fled. Lena's steps slowed. The prickling awareness her grandmother had named the sight crawled up the back of her neck, sharper than she'd felt it since the night of the ball. Callum, she called, though some part of her already knew he wouldn't answer. 3 figures emerged from the trees instead, moving with the loose, confident ease of wolves who had done this before. She recognized the house colors instantly, Ashworth's men, the same insignia the man in the corridor had worn 3 nights earlier. No cousins coming, little Omega, one of them said, circling wide to cut off the path back toward the hall. Just us. What do you want? Lena's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her pulse hammered hard enough that she was certain they could hear it. We want you gone. The lead wolf's smile held no warmth at all. Quietly, if you're smart about it. The king will grieve, maybe. He'll recover. Kings always do. But an unranked mate sitting beside him is an insult this territory won't tolerate forever, and the council's patience ran out days ago. They closed the distance before she could run, rough hands seizing her arms, dragging her back against a tree hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. She fought, clawed, twisted, screamed until her throat burned raw, but 3 trained alphas against 1 unranked Omega was never a fight she could win alone, and they all knew it. Then, somewhere deep in her chest, past the panic and the pain, she felt something else stir, a thread she hadn't known existed until the night of the ball, pulled suddenly, violently taut. Fear. Hers. Traveling somewhere she couldn't name. The forest went silent in an entirely different way a heartbeat later. The silence before something enormous arrives, before the world holds its breath and waits to see what walks through the trees. The first sound was a snarl that didn't belong to any wolf Lena had ever heard, something ancient and furious tearing through the underbrush with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. Ashworth's men barely had time to turn before Roman was among them, and whatever restraint he'd shown in the ballroom that first night was entirely, terrifyingly absent now. Lena slid down the trunk of the tree, breath ragged, and watched the Alpha King fight like something out of the oldest stories her grandmother used to tell, not a king defending property, but a wolf defending the other half of his soul, and woe to anyone foolish enough to have threatened it. The sounds that came from the border woods that morning would be spoken of in Cade Hall for years afterward, always in careful, lowered voices, as though saying it too loudly might summon the memory back to life. Lena didn't see all of it. She remembered fragments, the tree bark rough against her back, the taste of blood in her mouth where she'd bitten her own lip fighting, the impossible speed with which Roman moved between his enemies as though the space itself simply bent to let him through faster than it should have allowed. She remembered the moment it ended more clearly than anything else. Silence, sudden and complete, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the low, injured whimper of a wolf who would not be walking away from these woods without carrying what happened here for the rest of his life. And then Roman was in front of her, kneeling, his hands hovering over her as though he were afraid to touch her and afraid not to. Lena. Her name came out of him raw, stripped of every ounce of the composure he wore like a second skin. Look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me where. I'm okay, she managed, though her voice shook badly enough that neither of them believed it. Roman, I'm okay. They didn't. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to explain that the true damage wasn't the bruises forming along her arms but the cold, sick understanding that Ashworth's counsel had meant this. Had planned it. Had decided her life was an acceptable price for removing an inconvenience from their king's side. Roman gathered her against him without asking permission, and for the first time since the night of the ball, Lena let herself lean into it instead of holding herself apart. His heartbeat hammered beneath her ear, fast and unsteady, the first proof she'd seen that the legendary Alpha King could be shaken as badly as anyone else. I felt it, he said quietly, into her hair. The moment your fear spiked, I felt it like a blade through my own chest. I didn't know the bond could do that yet. I didn't know until this morning. I'm sorry, Lena whispered, absurdly, uselessly. Don't. His arms tightened. Don't you dare apologize for what they did to you. The walk back to Cade Hall passed in a blur, Roman refusing to let her walk unsupported despite her insistence that she could manage. By the time they reached the estate, word had already spread, servants gathering in doorways, pack members abandoning their morning duties to watch the king carry his mate across the threshold with blood on his knuckles and murder still simmering behind his eyes. The reckoning came within hours. Roman called the full council to the great hall before midday, and Lena, seated at his side despite her exhaustion, watched him dismantle Ashworth's political standing with the same cold precision he'd once used to end a king's reign. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply laid out, piece by piece, exactly what had been done in the border woods, exactly whose colors the attackers wore, exactly what house had ordered an assault against an unranked Omega under his protection. You will not deny this happened, Roman said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without effort. 3 of your men are currently under guard, and they have already told my enforcers everything I require to know. The only question remaining, Councilman Ashworth, is whether you ordered this yourself, or whether you simply failed to control the men beneath you enough to prevent it. Ashworth's face had gone the color of old parchment. My king, I would never. Then you will not object, Roman cut in, to my enforcers searching your correspondence. Immediately. In front of this council. The silence that followed told Lena everything she needed to know about guilt, long before the search confirmed it. By evening, Ashworth's seat on the council stood empty, his house stripped of its standing, its remaining loyalists scattered to lesser positions throughout the territory. It was, by every account Lena heard whispered among the staff afterward, the swiftest and most complete political destruction the pack had witnessed in a generation. That night, in the quiet of Roman's private study, away from council eyes and pack politics, Lena finally asked the question that had been building in her since the border woods. Why do they hate this so much? An unranked mate. I understand fear of change, but this, trying to kill me, that's something else. Roman was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire rather than at her. Because I proved something the day I took this throne, he said finally. I proved that rank doesn't determine strength. That a wolf born with nothing could still end a dynasty that had ruled for generations, if he was willing to do what needed doing. Ashworth's council built their entire authority on the idea that bloodline determines worth. You standing beside me as my mate is a living argument against everything they've told themselves for years. He finally looked at her. You terrify them more than I ever could alone, Lena. Because I'm proof rank can be broken once. You're proof it might not matter at all. That's a lot to put on someone who was hiding behind a pillar 4 days ago, Lena said, half a laugh, half something closer to tears. I know. Roman reached for her hand, careful, deliberate, the same way he'd approached her that first night in the ballroom. I'm sorry this is the life you've stepped into. I wish I could promise you it gets easier. Can you? No. His honesty didn't surprise her anymore. It had become the one thing she trusted most about him. But I can promise you I will never let another wolf lay hands on you again. Whatever it costs me. Lena studied him in the firelight, the king who had ended a dynasty, who had just dismantled a council in an afternoon, who now sat holding her hand like it was the only fragile thing left in his entire world worth protecting. Something in her chest, long guarded, long convinced she would never belong anywhere fully, began, cautiously, terrifyingly, to loosen. Tell me about him, she said quietly. The king before you. What he did. What it cost you to end it. Roman's jaw tightened, old grief surfacing behind his eyes. He starved unranked pups outside pack walls in winter, to remind everyone what rank meant. I lost someone that way, before I ever became what I am now. He met her gaze, steady despite the pain in it. I didn't take this throne for power, Lena. I took it so no one else would have to bury someone the way I buried mine. Lena didn't speak. She simply tightened her fingers around his, an answer more honest than any words could have offered, and for the first time since the ball, the space between them felt less like fate forcing two strangers together, and more like two wounded people finally recognizing each other. The weeks following Ashworth's fall settled into something Lena hadn't expected to feel inside the walls of Cade Hall, quiet. Not the tense, watchful quiet of a court waiting to see her fail, but something closer to peace, fragile and unfamiliar, the kind she wasn't yet sure she trusted enough to fully lean into. The remaining council members treated her differently now, not warmly, not yet, that would take longer than a single scandal to earn, but with a wary respect that hadn't existed before the border woods. Word had spread through the pack of what Roman had done to protect her, and more than that, word had spread of what she'd survived. Surviving seemed to carry its own kind of rank in this world, one the registry had never bothered to record, and for the first time in her life, Lena felt eyes on her that weren't measuring her worth and finding it lacking. Callum noticed the shift before she did. He found her one afternoon in the garden, sketching absently in a notebook she'd carried since childhood, and dropped onto the bench beside her with the particular ease of someone no longer bracing for disaster. You look different, he said. Different how? Lighter. He nudged her shoulder, the same gesture he'd used at the ball what felt like a lifetime ago. I haven't seen you sit still like this in years, Lena. Not since before you got your registry results back. She didn't have a response for that, mostly because he wasn't wrong, and she wasn't yet ready to examine why. It was Roman who raised the subject that actually mattered, later that evening, in the garden where the moon hung low and heavy over the hall, much the way it had the night he'd first told her the truth about the bond between them. There's a ceremony, he said carefully, watching her rather than the sky above them. The claiming right. It would make the bond permanent. Not just recognized, the way it is now, but fused, my life to yours, yours to the pack's, in a way that cannot be undone once it's begun. Lena's chest tightened. You told me the bond was already permanent. The pull is permanent, Roman corrected gently. That part was decided the moment my wolf recognized you. But the right itself is a choice, and an entirely different kind of binding, physical, spiritual, absolute. It makes you lunar in every sense the word carries. Full authority. Full protection under pack law that no council, no faction, could ever legally challenge again, not the way Ashworth tried to. He paused, and something careful entered his expression, the look of a man choosing his next words with real weight behind them. It's also dangerous, Lena. The ritual asks a great deal of an Omega's body, especially one who hasn't trained for it her entire life the way ranked wolves are raised to. There's real risk. I won't stand here and pretend otherwise, not to you, not after everything. How much risk? Enough that I need you to choose this with your eyes fully open. His hand found hers, steady, grounding, exactly the way it had the first night he'd walked her through this same garden. Not out of fear of what happened in the woods. Not because you feel you owe me anything for what I did to protect you that morning. Only if it's what you actually want, for yourself, apart from me entirely. Lena walked the garden path in silence for a long moment, turning the choice over the way she'd once turned over every rejection, every closed door, every quiet reminder that the world had already decided her value before she'd had a chance to prove otherwise. She thought of Callum's worried eyes the morning after the ball. She thought of Ashworth's cold assessment at that first formal dinner, the way he'd said unranked like it left a residue on his tongue. She thought of the sensation crawling up the back of her neck the night of the ball, the sight her grandmother had gifted her, the one that had never once been wrong about danger, and had somehow, impossibly, also never once warned her away from Roman. Can I ask you something first? She said. Anything. If I say no. If I decide I want the bond to just exist, quietly, without the right. Does that change anything? For you, for the pack, for how this council sees me. Roman considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, without rushing toward the answer that would be easiest to hear. It changes some things, he admitted. Without the right, there are those who would argue the bond isn't binding, that it could still be broken, that you're temporary, in a way that would embolden people like Ashworth's remaining loyalists to try again. I won't lie to you about that. His thumb moved gently over her knuckles. But it wouldn't change what I feel, Lena. It wouldn't change that I intend to protect you regardless of what title you carry. If you tell me no, tonight or any night, I will not treat it as a failure on your part. I need you to understand that clearly before you decide anything. Something in Lena's chest loosened at that, some old, defensive posture she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was optional. You keep doing that, she said quietly. Giving me the choice back, every time I brace for you to take it away instead. That's rather the point of choosing someone, Roman said, the ghost of a smile touching his mouth. I don't want a mate who was cornered into this. I want one who walked into it, eyes open, and meant it. Lena thought of her whole life before this, the file marked unranked, the years of being told, gently or cruelly, exactly where she didn't belong. She thought of the ballroom, of Draven's hand closing around her wrist like she was something to be claimed rather than asked. And then she thought of every moment since, every instance Roman had paused to ask rather than assume, to offer rather than demand. I spent my whole life being told I didn't matter enough to be claimed by anyone, she said finally. Not a pack. Not a rank. Not even a seat at most tables. I'm not choosing this because I'm afraid of being unclaimed again, Roman. I've been unclaimed my entire life, and I survived it just fine. She turned to face him fully, steadying her voice before she continued. I'm choosing this because for the first time, someone looked at all of that, the rank I don't have, the fear I still carry, the mess of everything I am, and decided it made me worth fighting for instead of leaving behind. I want that. I want you. Whatever the right costs either of us. Roman's composure, so carefully held through council chambers and battlefields and every careful conversation since the ball, finally broke completely. He pulled her against him, his forehead resting against hers, breathing her in like a man finally permitted to believe in something after years spent guarding himself against exactly this kind of hope. Then we do this together, he murmured against her hair. Whatever it costs either of us, we carry it together. Behind them, unseen in the dark, the first pale light of the coming ceremony's moon was already beginning to rise above the tree line, patient and inevitable, as though it had been waiting all along for her to say yes. The night of the claiming right arrived 7 days later, timed to the full rise of a moon the pack elders called auspicious, though Lena privately thought it looked no different from any other moon she'd watched from her window her entire life. She stood now in a private chamber off the great hall, dressed in ceremonial white, watching her own hands tremble in the mirror's reflection and trying to remember Roman's voice telling her that fear didn't mean the same thing as doubt. Aunt Miriam had arrived that morning, summoned by Roman himself despite Lena's protests that she didn't need to see this. Her aunt stood behind her now, fussing with the pins in Lena's hair with hands that shook slightly more than she'd admit. "I didn't think I'd live to see this," Miriam said quietly. "An unranked girl, standing where you were about to stand." "You pushed me to go to that ball," Lena reminded her. "You don't get to act surprised now." "I pushed you because I hoped someone would finally see you the way I always did." Miriam met her eyes in the mirror, uncharacteristically soft. "I didn't imagine it would be the king himself." "Are you frightened?" "Terrified," Lena admitted. "Roman told me there's real risk. That the right could kill me if the bond isn't strong enough to carry it." "And is it?" Miriam asked. "Strong enough?" Lena thought of the ballroom, of the growl that had shaken chandeliers before either of them understood why. Of the border woods, of fear traveling down a thread she hadn't known existed until it saved her life. "I have to believe it is," she said. "Because I've already decided I'm not walking away from this." The great hall had been transformed by the time she entered it, candlelight replacing the electric chandeliers of the mating ball. The entire council and half the ranked wolves of the territory gathered in solemn rows to witness what came next. Roman stood at the center of it all, dressed in ceremonial black, his white hair catching candlelight the way it had caught neon that first terrible, wonderful night. His eyes found hers the moment she stepped through the doors, and something in his expression, pride, fear, devotion, all tangled together, nearly undid her composure before the ceremony had even begun. The pack elder presiding over the rite spoke words older than the hall itself, a ritual language Lena didn't fully understand but felt in her bones regardless, a current of old magic humming beneath the formal cadence. Roman took her hands. The elder marked their joined wrists with something warm and dark that wasn't quite blood and wasn't quite anything Lena had a name for, and then the true rite began. The pain arrived first, sharper than anything she'd braced for, a burning that raced up both arms and settled somewhere behind her sternum like a brand pressed directly against her soul. She gasped, knees buckling, and Roman caught her before she fell, his own face tight with a matching agony she could see reflected in his eyes. "Stay with me," he said, low, urgent, meant only for her. "Lena. Stay with me." The bond between them, already strong enough to shatter glass and drop an entire hall to its knees, strained now toward something far more absolute, threading through her chest like fire finding new fuel. She felt her wolf rise to meet it, the wolf she'd spent her whole unranked life keeping small, quiet, unremarkable, and for the first time, she let it answer fully, let it surge forward without apology or restraint. The pain broke like a wave crashing past its peak, and in its place came something entirely different. Warmth, vast and settling, a sense of belonging so complete it felt less like gaining something new and more like finally remembering something she'd always been meant to carry. She opened her eyes to find Roman still holding her, both of them breathing hard, the mark on their joined wrists now silver bright and unmistakably permanent. The hall erupted, not in the fearful silence of the ballroom weeks earlier, but in something closer to reverence. Even the remaining council members, wary and slow to soften, bent their heads in acknowledgement neither Ashworth nor his allies would have ever offered willingly. "Rise," the elder intoned, "and be seen. Luna Voscade, mate and equal to the Alpha King." Lena rose on unsteady legs, Roman's hand steady beneath her elbow, and turned to face the hall that had once watched her hide behind a pillar, hoping not to be noticed. No one was looking away now. Every wolf in that room, ranked and unranked alike, watched her with the same weighted attention once reserved only for Roman himself, and for the first time in her life, Lena didn't feel the urge to shrink beneath it. Later, much later, when the ceremony had given way to quiet celebration and the hall had begun to empty into the night, Roman found her near the same garden path where he'd first asked her to consider a future she'd never dared imagine for herself. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Different," Lena admitted, flexing fingers that still hummed faintly with the aftermath of the rite. "Whole, somehow. Like something that was always meant to fit finally clicked into place." "That's the bond," Roman said. "Fully settled now. Nothing left to sever it." "Good," Lena said, and meant it entirely. "I spent so long being told I was unranked, unwanted, unremarkable. I don't want that thread anymore. I want this one." Roman drew her against him beneath the same moon that had watched over the mating ball, the border woods, and now the rite that bound them beyond any council's power to undo. "Then let it be known," he murmured against her hair, "that the girl who once tried to disappear behind a pillar now stands at the very center of everything I am. Let Ashworth's ghosts and every wolf who ever doubted you see exactly what became of the Omega they thought didn't matter." Lena closed her eyes, listening to his heartbeat, steady now in a way it hadn't been since the moment a stranger's hand first closed around her wrist. The ballroom that had once felt like a trap now felt, at last, like the beginning of everything, and for the first time in her life, Lena Voss didn't feel like prey wandering into unfamiliar territory. She felt like she'd finally come home. If Lena and Roman's story pulled you in, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this world, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and who your favorite character was. Was it Roman? Callum? Or did you want Ashworth to get exactly what was coming to him? I read every comment, and your thoughts genuinely shape what story comes next. Like this video if you want more Alpha King romances like this one, and share it with someone who needs a good fated mate story in their life. See you in the next one.